In this video, we propose to examine a question which is asked by many, either openly or in the silences of their personal suffering. What is that question? The question is, why do people become so insensitive and indifferent in the materialistic culture? We are living in the age of materialism when, according to Karl Marx, even living things become like lifeless objects. Or to use the term that Marx used, human beings get thinged, thinged, thinged. That is, they become more and more like things, lifeless, insensitive, material objects. To give an illustration from literature, even if you're not from the discipline of literature, even if you have not been a student of literature, it doesn't matter. T.S. Eliot was an English poet. One of his very celebrated poems is The Wasteland, written and published in the 30s of the last century, nearly 100 years ago. In that poem, it's a long poem. It's considered an epic on modern life, The Wasteland. In that poem, the lady typist returns from her work. Her husband is a bank clerk. They're husband and wife, and therefore the wife tries to initiate a conversation. No matter how hard he tries, she fails. She becomes desperate. And she says, "Why don't you speak to me? Speak to me, speak." But he's not able to engage her in a conversation. It's very much like trying to initiate a conversation with a piece of stone. And the death of communication is an important theme in contemporary literature. The irony of it is that this is happening at a time when the technology of communication has been nearly perfected. So, the inability to communicate in this century of communication is one of the tragic ironies of modern life. However, that is not our main concern, though it is related to the concern that I am trying to raise with you. And this is an issue of serious magnitude as far as young people are concerned. Soon after getting married, very often through love marriages, both husband and wife face this problem that they are not able to relate to each other. People long to relate to their life partners in depth, in personal depth, but there is no depth. And therefore, disenchantment begins to be activated almost immediately after the wedding. This is very unfortunate, but this is very real. Hence, this question, a question that many people have raised with me. Why is it that human beings are not able to relate to each other in depth? In this context, I remember reading a book by Oswald Spengler. The title of the book is The Decline of the West. It is in 2 volumes. It's a very scholarly work. I'm not asking you to read that work. It's not an easy read. But one of the themes that Oswald Spengler, it's a very controversial book. One of the themes that Oswald Spengler deals with in that book is the shallowness of the Western culture. And he points out that the modern man is alienated from the depth of things. He says he has become afraid of depth because all his genius is the ability to deal only with the surface of things. And this superficiality which afflicts the formation of human personality, is a byproduct of the materialistic culture. Now, I'm going to explain the logic of it. Please bear with me. Now, in order to explain this, let me use a particular reference from the Gospel. The instance I have in mind is the temptation of Jesus Christ, particularly the first temptation to which Satan subjects Jesus. Jesus is very hungry after having fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and Satan comes and tempts him, saying that if you are the Son of God, command these stones to be turned into loaves of bread. You can quench your, assuage your hunger. And then Jesus says something very significant, the profundity of which is not adequately understood by Christians. He says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, what does he mean by it? The temptation that Satan presents to Jesus is to eat, if necessary, even stone. Well, using his supernatural powers, Jesus can transform stones into bread, but essentially it is stone. So it is actually a temptation to repose one's faith entirely in matter. Now, the most significant feature of matter is that it is insensitive. Matter is insensitive. Suppose a block of stone is on my table. Let's assume for the sake of argument. Now, I may sit in front of that piece of stone in a state of extreme happiness, which I sometimes experience when I read good books or when a new idea comes into my mind. I go into spells of ecstasy. It's true. It means nothing to this piece of stone sitting in front of me. Or the next day, I sit in front of that stone with my heart broken because something extremely tragic has happened. It means nothing to that piece of stone. Now, that's the feature, that is the essential nature of matter. Matter in itself, by itself, is insensitive. And what is materialism? I remember reading an article by Joseph Conrad, one of the great novelists of the 20th century, a writer of Polish origin. His name was Joseph Korzeniowski Conrad, and he became a naturalized citizen of England, and he became a major novelist. And I remember teaching one of his novels, Lord Jim, to the undergraduate students of St. Stephen's College. In that context, of course, I read the other works of Conrad, particularly his articles, the many essays that he wrote, very interesting essays. One of them was on the sinking of the Titanic. There he says that the Titanic is a body blow to the materialistic worldview of the Western people. Then he says the essence of materialism is matter alone matters, matter saves. So you don't have to look beyond the resources of matter to live in this world. Not realizing that if you bang entirely on matter, you will become like matter. So this culture, this way of life based on materialism will reduce us to insensitive objects, something that Karl Marx, as I referred to earlier, pointed out a long time ago. So it's logical that if we succumb to this materialistic culture, which has its own seductions, very powerful seductions, and if we understand all the pleasures and stimulations and fulfillments of life in terms alone of what the materialistic culture can offer, and it has got great resources to offer, no doubt, then without our knowing it, we become more and more like insensitive objects, like pieces of stone. And we suffer what's called an emotional death. That's the reason why in contemporary times people talk about the emotional quotient or the desensitization that the materialistic culture inflicts on people. Human beings become like robots if They are not developed in their emotional equipment. What's the point in being human if you can't feel? As in the case of the husband of this lady typist in T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland. What are you thinking of? What thinking what? Why don't you speak to me? Speak. The man simply says, I think we are in the rat's alley where the dead men lost their bones. He's not actually responding to her. He's actually recalling some kind of something that he heard in the theater. So even while his wife is standing in front of him and pleading him to enter into a conversation with her, his mind is wandering somewhere else. For him, his wife doesn't really exist. That may be an acute state, but it is not an unusual one. So, if this is a problem, if you recognize this to be a problem, and if you have had anything to do with the life of people, as I was privileged to have, I can tell you that this is such a huge problem and quite a widespread problem, which causes massive human suffering today, about which everybody keeps a conspiratorial silence. We need to talk about these issues. Then, in that context, we can understand the response of Jesus to the temptation by Satan. Why does Jesus say man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God? Jesus is here positing or instituting a contrast between bread and God. Bread and God. Why? Because God is all sensitive. God knows. If you know, you are sensitive. God is exactly the opposite of matter. And therefore, the very idea, the very purpose of the Word of God is to make us as unlike material objects as possible. Unfortunately, Christians have learned the very difficult and strange art of combining materialism with the Word of God, subjugating the Word of God to the pursuit of materialism, as in the prosperity gospel, as a result of which all that happens is that the degradation of the human being to the level of inanimate, insensitive objects is given some kind of pietistic veneers, pietistic shroud or cover up, which is a terrible thing. So, the very purpose of the Word of God, as I said in one of my earlier videos, the Bible per se is not the Word of God. The Bible, as it is incarnated, the text of the Bible as it is incarnated through us, becomes the Word of God. The very purpose of that is to activate the depth in us. And that depth will always crave for fullness, fullness of understanding, fullness of the capacity to respond adequately, fullness of the sense of wonder about life, and as an intuition of the fullness of the other person, which makes you respect that person and love without dissimulation. That is when relationships become very rewarding, rich, life affirming. Short of that, every relationship harbors unending resentment. And people live burdened with relationships, whereas the very purpose of relationships is to make life lighter, happier, joyful, cheerful. So, there's a serious problem in materialism, the materialistic culture about which we are so proud today, particularly as it is armed to the teeth with technology, which induces a sense of power and the delusions of sufficiency. So, ultimately, as the French philosopher Jacques Ellul said, all that we have achieved through our adventure into this materialistic culture is that we have become victims of our own handiwork. We today suffer from what we ourselves have created. This great adventure of materialistic progress. I'm not against progress, by the way. but I have a different reading of progress, a different understanding of progress. And I firmly believe that progress must be informed spiritually. That's another issue. It's not the occasion for me to discuss that. Short of that, as Jacques Ellul points out, we could end up as victims of our own handiwork. Who created this materialistic culture? Not God, human beings. And we created it with a great sense of pride. Tremendous breakthroughs, one after the other, one after the other, one after the other. And together with that, human hubris began to rise sky high. And see what has happened everywhere. The world is today groaning under the mountainous suffering that human beings inflict upon fellow human beings. I don't have to cite instances. But more than that is the suffering that is not evident at all, the suffering that remains the invisible aspect, but a really powerful aspect to the life of almost every individual who lives cheated of the fullness of life and lives burdened by the sense of great frustration, disappointment, disenchantment. I remember reading a book a long time ago. Unfortunately, I forget the title of the book now, which talks about how disenchantment is used to promote sales in the market. The psychology of chronic disenchantment. It's easy to understand. How do, for example, the manufacturers of mobile phones promote their sales? If you have one mobile phone, you should be able to use it for 15, 20 years. You remember the old land phones we had? Who ever thought of changing a landline receiver every year or every second year, or every third year? If you got one instrument, it remained with you for at least one generation, if not more. Not so in the case of mobiles. How do these manufacturers, via advertisement, push their sales? Using the psychology of disenchantment. When, say, Apple 2023 model came in the market, suddenly you got disenchanted with the 2022 model that you acquired with great enchantment. That enchantment will last only till the new model hits the market. And the moment you come to know that the new model has come to the factory outlets, the sales centers, you begin to feel disenchanted with the previous model for absolutely no rhyme or reason. The old instrument will do just as well. You gain nothing by buying the new model. But you get suddenly disenchanted with the old model, and the new model, which has just hit the market, enchants you, and you will be restless till you have acquired it. Or you will suffer from a sense of underprivilege if you don't acquire the latest in the market. Now, this delusion keeps us enslaved to the market and feeds us on the illusion that our worth is somehow commensurate with the material gadgets that we acquire, whereas our happiness, our sense of well being, our human richness has nothing to do with any of these things. What's the point in having the latest and the most expensive phone if you cannot maintain a happy conversation with anybody in the world? So, anyway, the point I'm making is simple. The materialistic culture takes a very huge toll on us. Therefore, what are we to do? That's precisely the essence and the temptation that Jesus faced. We need to complement the advantages offered by the materialistic culture with the added input required to sustain the humanness in us. That's where spirituality should come in. That's precisely what Jesus is saying. Man does not live by bread alone. If you live by bread alone, you will become like a piece of bread at most, And in that context, we'll become like a piece of stone. For after all, this bread is nothing but stone turned into bread. So ultimately, you'll become like a piece of stone, which will be the complete demise of Jesus' mission upon this earth. So Jesus says that there is danger in this. What needs to happen is man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The function of the word of God is to kindle, to stir up, to wake up the depth in us. That is why Jesus denounces hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is the piety of the surface. It's the denial of the depth. It's a very contradiction of what godliness should mean. So, religiosity which is predicated on hypocrisy is the ultimate mockery of the human. It's much worse than materialism. So, therefore, young people in particular need to be very, very mindful of the fact that there are serious pitfalls, serious problems immanent in the materialistic culture. I don't want to damn the materialistic culture en bloc, en masse. I'm only based on my experience, my reading, my reflection, my interaction with people who are its victims, so many of them. I'm only alerting young people to be wiser and to supplement what the materialistic world offers with the resources that are available to us from the sphere of spirituality. And it's only when we complement the material world with the spiritual that we arrive at something like a balanced formation of our personality. Otherwise, we'll be wonky in our formation and we'll become more and more like material objects, utterly incapable of emotions, feelings, sentiments. And we'll walk like zombies in this world, unable to understand, unable to feel, unable to think, and unable to respond. Much like the priest that Jesus portrays in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who comes and sees a man in dire need but turns his face in the opposite direction and walks away because he was the proponent of hypocrisy, religious hypocrisy. And even though he is not a product of cultural materialism, he was a proponent of religious materialism. What is religious materialism? Practicing religion for the sake of mammon. That's why Jesus says, no man can serve two masters, God and mammon. Either you will love the one or hate the other. So there's a serious problem here. I can only plead with my young friends to take this to heart, to ponder seriously over this, and to make sure that their personality formation is not flawed through an exclusive dependence on the resources, the stereotypes, the assumptions, and the goals of the materialistic culture in this world. Thank you. All the very best.